5-minute warning, but man, she's like clockwork. She knows this stuff and delivers it just on time. So that was amazing, and there's so much more to it. With that, our next speaker, Dr. Suzanne Humphries. How many of you are familiar with her work, her lectures, her books? Her initial book that I made contact with when I first started my own inquiry into this, Dissolving Illusions, is the go-to Bible for anybody who reaches out to me and says, where do I begin? Well, this is where you begin. We're lucky to have her, and without further ado, I'm going to let her have her 45 minutes with us. Thank you. So I had a lot of people RSVP that they weren't coming in until about 11. So I want to start the activist momentum here, and each and every one of you, pick up your phones, post on Facebook, do a Twitter, send an email, a message or something, and invite a friend. Because we really have a golden opportunity right now to reach out to our community and say, show up now, we need you, we want you, this is the time. That's it.
And you have my permission to take shots of all of my slides, and I think that you probably have to because some of them are rather complicated, and I'm happy to move rather quickly. 45 minutes, as you know, is a very short time for me for a talk. See people have been listening. So I call this herd immunity the unsettled science because I'm so sick of hearing how the science is settled, especially after learning the truth. Next, please. So this was me in the very beginning. My name is Dr. Suzanne Humphries, and I've been a licensed medical doctor since 1996. And I used to write vaccine orders as a matter of routine, never really thinking twice. And back then, I believed all the sound bites that I heard, and that vaccines were safe and effective and should be given on time. Next, please. I also thought that all kids needed to be vaccinated in order to get the best community protection. Well, that dogma was really easy to grab onto. It seemed logical at the time. And then in 2004, I remember castigating a friend of mine for not vaccinating her 2 children. My exact words to her were, oh, so your 2 princesses are protected while the rest of the world is vaccinating their kids. Today I cringe when I realize the ignorance of my reprimand. That mother never argued back with me. She knew her kids were healthier than the others, and she knew in her gut that she was doing the right thing for them. My words had no effect on her, fortunately, but her children later had huge effect upon me because I'd never seen such healthy children, and I'd never seen such healthy children as their friends who were also unvaccinated, rarely got sick, and never needed antibiotics. But that was not the end of my vaccine conversations. In 2009, there was a convergence of events, which gave me a very rude awakening. In a short period of time, some of my office patients, hospital patients, and outpatients I had not seen before fell ill after vaccination. One such case could be called coincidence, but not as many as I saw back then. And after I kept looking, more damage became obvious, but only after I started asking the question, when was your last vaccine? So I did what any doctor would do, and I took these problems to the clinical director at the hospital. Next, please. Not knowing that I was going to run slap into a brick wall of power hierarchies, which remained unmoved by the questioner of dogma and policy. I discussed all the evidence I found for over a year with the administration and with my various colleagues. And I wrote an article that can be read on this link from my website. And I later went into even more detail in a YouTube video called Honesty versus Policy, which covers a lot of ground. Because the medical leaders of my hospital could not answer me themselves, they brought in an expert to set me straight. Next. He never addressed any of my questions regarding acute kidney patients or acutely ill new admissions getting vaccinated as part of hospital policy. His letter to me was a canned response filled with CDC webpage links and a few medical articles to prove to me that HIV patients mounted antibody to vaccines, which had nothing to do with the cases I was concerned about. The result of hitting that wall of autocracy was a newfound desire to hop the wall and get away. I also realize that there are multitudes of patients who want to do the same and leave the system, which imprisons them inside fixed mindsets. For the record, I didn't leave the medical profession. I left the hospital of my own free will, and I continued to have privileges to practice in 2 states. I believe that conventional medicine has value in specific situations. Stung by many comments that were thrown at me while in the system, I started researching history and diseases and co-authored a book called Dissolving Illusions. Since then, I've continued looking at the dynamics of disease and a more full picture of not just different vaccine-preventable diseases, but also what makes a normal immune system work best. Over the years, I have amassed a large library of historical, immunological, and vaccine history. Many of my other talks are available on YouTube for you to learn from. In 2016, I released a retrospective of my personal and professional life, covering the years from the end of high school up to today. It's an autobiography which has been widely reviewed as a page-turner that people can't put down. I wrote this book for parents so that they could see firsthand just how medical education is designed, how limited it is, and how a doctor can be bright-eyed and altruistic in the beginning and then wind up heartsick from the whole ordeal once they realize that being a healer is not actually part of the curriculum. You can read the Amazon reviews and the look inside function for more details. Herd immunity is not something we can discuss for all vaccines at once, even though the pro-vaccine would have you think you could. The reality of community immunity from vaccination varies from vaccine to vaccine. I've chosen pertussis, which is whooping cough, to speak about today since it's relevant and fits into the 45-minute time slot better than measles does. So this idea of vaccinated people protecting the vulnerable was extrapolated from following historical dynamics of naturally immune populations. There was an assumption that vaccines would do the same thing, and that assumption turned out to be, admittedly, in the medical literature, dead wrong. In the 1920s, when Dr. A.W. Hedrick tracked measles disease in Baltimore, Maryland, is where this came from. And just prior to a major epidemic, the proportion of the population under 15 estimated to be susceptible ranged from 45 to 50%. And at the end of those epidemics, the proportion dropped to 30 to 35%, which meant that 15% of the childhood population would be infected at any given time. That's not very many people, certainly far less than they would have us believe the old days used to be like. And very young babies and adults didn't get measles like they did today. By the age of 20, and this is the important part, is that 95 to 99% of the population was lifelong immune to measles from acquiring clinical measles virus infection. Next slide, please. Today we have vaccines that are supposed to mimic that herd dynamic, but they're not doing the job. And some vaccines I want you to know about don't eradicate the target microbe, so they have no bearing whatsoever on herd immunity. So that argument is lost straight out of the box. When you look at inactivated polio vaccines, that makes your body make an antibody. If you swallow that virus, you're still going to excrete it and spread it all about. So that vaccine does not prevent spread of the virus. Tetanus and diphtheria are toxoid vaccines. Again, they may protect you if you're lucky. However, they will not stop the spread of disease. And some meningococcal vaccines, like meningitis B, which is being now recommended for college students, even the vaccinated are still colonized in the throat after they're vaccinated. It's a very well-known fact. Okay, next slide, please. Parents come to me today after they diagnose whooping cough because the doctor can't recognize it or outright denies it, often refusing to test for it until the parents insist, usually after the child has been coughing violently for weeks and the prescribed treatments for the wrong infection fail. Pediatricians and family doctors today appear to be so stuck in a rut of their own brainwashing that they no longer appear to understand the real clinical issues or even what our own medical literature states. Let's first look at the history. This is a slide from Dissolving Illusions, and you can go look at this for free in color at dissolvingillusions.com. It's also in the book. This shows the United States whooping cough incidence and death rate. Note that just like with measles, while the disease was raging, which is the black line, the death rate was steadily declining, which is the orange line. before antibiotics and before vaccines came onto the scene. Many vaccine enthusiasts still claim that antibiotics are responsible for the decline in morbidity and mortality for whooping cough, among other diseases. But you can see that the trend was unaffected by antibiotic usage in the late 1940s, not to mention that the antibiotics invented then would have had very poor coverage for this particular bacteria. Next, please. Because the one-dose hope for pertussis prevention failed so miserably, we're now told that children require 5 doses of vaccine by their 4th to 6th year of life. It's actually 6 if you count the in utero vaccine. And still there are big problems which prompted a recent 6-dose recommendation to 11 and 12-year-olds. Now this graph shows cases of pertussis in California in 2010. The orange bar is cases that have between 1 and 4 doses, and most of them will be 4 doses. And the yellow bars represent 5 doses. You can see that these vaccinated children represent a much higher part of the childhood population getting pertussis than the babies who can't get vaccinated. Nonetheless, the expert opinion remains that we need to keep using this vaccine and give more and more of it to everyone. Here are the current recommendations. Next slide, please. In the United States, consists of the in utero vaccine during 3rd trimester, which I didn't list, 2 months, 4 months, 6 months shot, 15 to 18 months, then at 4 to 6 years another one, 11 to 12 years another one, and then supposedly every 10 years is enough. Mainly we were told that was for tetanus, but now pregnant women are told that for each pregnancy they need to be vaccinated, even if you're pregnant every year. And then the over 65 group is told that they need to be vaccinated to protect the grandchildren. And while the CDC website is very vague in how often those grandparents should be vaccinated, most grandparents that I talk to who contact me say that they are asked to be vaccinated every time there's a new grandchild. And there's actually good reason for that, because the effectiveness of this vaccine is terrible. And this is what the CDC admits to. And we know the vaccine given in childhood needs frequent boosters, and the adult Tdap wears off very rapidly too. So clearly nobody should think that this vaccine is a good herd immunity tool for protecting babies. The best it will do is stop the vaccinated person from coughing for a short period of time. But that didn't stop GlaxoSmithKline from firing up a huge blackmail campaign which places the elderly in the crosshairs of guilt, as seen in this medical journal advertisement, maintaining that if grandma doesn't have a whooping cough vaccine, her whooping cough could eat your baby up. So the solution for grandparents is a lifetime of vaccines. Please click again. Grandma would have had her 6 childhood vaccines, again please. Then she would have had 6 children, that's 6 more Tdap vaccines. I think there's one more click in there. If doctors and new parents continue to persuade grandparents to be vaccinated before every child is born because they lose their antibodies, then this mother who has had 6 children and 12 pertussis shots then lives long enough, and her 6 children each have 6 grandchildren, which makes 36 grandchildren. This poor grandmother's life could be that of a needle cushion. Go ahead and do the math for yourself. If poor grandma survives the shots, she might have had over 45 shots by retirement age. What doctors who keep changing the vaccine schedule might not know is that if a person's immunity comes from a vaccine and not the normal infection, they have something called original antigenic sin. Otherwise, the sanitized term used today is linked epitope suppression, which means that because the vaccine effect didn't start in the respiratory system, that strong immunity is not present at the lung surface. And because the vaccine doesn't have all the components that the live bacteria has, that part of the immune system is tricked into silence by the vaccine programming. The result is that the vaccinated become silent carriers of the bacteria upon re-exposure. Okay. What doctors who keep changing, sorry, I'm still making this what GlaxoSmithKline ad should have said. The vaccine only has the potential to stop you, the vaccinated person, from coughing for a short time. But if you contact whooping cough, you can carry it without symptoms for 6 weeks and spread it to the baby. Asymptomatic spread of whooping cough is largely a problem of the acellular vaccine, which, like the flu vaccine, also primes the immune system the wrong way. And that's why whooping cough is now having such an uncontrolled resurgence. This was clearly demonstrated in a landmark experiment done by Morfell's group and published in 2014. What they did is they got there were actually 4 groups of baboons, but I'm going to just simplify it. So the 3 groups I want to talk about were on the slide. No. The whole cell vaccine was given to one group at 2, 4, and 6 months of age. The acellular vaccine, which is the one that we use today, was given at 2, 4, and 6 months of age. And then one group was allowed to become infected with pertussis, and then they waited 7 months. Upon which they re-exposed these animals by intranasal inoculation. Okay. And the results are nothing the CDC or GlaxoSmithKline want to broadcast. The vaccinated mounted a weak Th2, the acellular vaccinated mounted a weak Th2 biased response, and I'll explain what that is in a moment, that did not prevent them from becoming colonized. Next. But perhaps even worse was that the cage mates that were later placed in contact with the vaccinated pertussis-exposed animals became infected by the asymptomatic vaccinated baboons. Take that in for a minute. Next. So these next 2 slides may be the most important ones in my talk. Do I have a pointer? Guess not. I'm pressing buttons. Because parents are always asking me what they can do to prevent disease. And everything that Dr. Judy just talked about also applies here, because whether you're infected with a retrovirus or any kind of a virus, your immune system is key to dealing with it. It's key to survival and key to not even noticing you're infected. So let me give you a crash course on innate and acquired immunity. A person's first experience with a natural infection usually happens through one of the linings: the nose, the throat, the lungs, or the gut. And most diseases have a period of days and sometimes weeks before people seem sick and then recover. Most microbes we are met with never make us sick at all, even though they have full capacity to kill us under certain conditions. Why is this? It has to do with the effectiveness of every level of immunity represented on this picture. So if we look at the first panel there, what that's showing you, maybe we can dim the lights a little so that people can see this.
Because then they can't see you on the video.
They can just remember me.
We're going to be putting these slides in the video, edited into the video.
Fair enough. Okay, so the first slide basically shows a normal, healthy integument, whether it's skin or throat or intestine, or your nose or your sinuses. And so what you have on the top is the membrane layer. And outside of that, there may be your normal microbes, which are actually your normal flora, which is a very important part of the immune system that the medical system completely ignores. And then under there, you have local chemical factors, and then you have those cells underneath that one line that are specialty cells like macrophages and dendritic cells that can munch up anything that gets past that barrier. So most of the time, that's the condition we live in, healthy. Microbes come and go. We don't even notice they're there. But say that some of these microbes do get in, like in the second panel, then you have another line of defense. And so the bad microbes breach the good microbes and that membrane and get in. And so there's a little bit of local heat production, perhaps a little tickle in the throat, maybe a little redness around a mosquito bite. And so the wound healing is induced, and antimicrobial proteins and peptides, and then those cells under the membrane are activated, and then you can kick that problem right out. Or if you're weak, you can continue to let that infection go deeper, and then you have a fever, and then you have other elements of the immune system activated, like complements, cytokines, chemokines. These are all words of how the immune cells communicate with each other and with your brain. And then you can get better, or you can continue to get sicker. So say you get a serious case of measles, then you end up in panel 4. And so you can have high spiking fevers, and at that point, that's when your memory immunity becomes activated. And that's what vaccines are after, okay? So you can see that there are all these levels of normal, healthy immune response that are there before a vaccine could even ever get into the picture. And those first three panels are there in a healthy person and a newborn baby. They're all there ready to do the job, keeping you alive and healthy. So the oldest plague of sailors is scurvy, which is vitamin C deficiency at its worst. But even today, I see people with bright red gums or other signs and symptoms of vitamin C deficiency. And those people are sitting ducks for illness and bad outcomes from any microbe, because vitamin C is crucial to every step that I just described. So let's look at the 3 layers of immunity in a different way. Next slide, please. In order to understand how vaccines versus normal disease enter the body. So this is basically the same thing I just showed you, but to make a different point. So that top layer is your innate immunity, your natural microbes, and some preformed antibody perhaps, and those Pallas guard cells that are sitting under your skin or your mucous membranes. And that can be activated in 0 to 4 hours. So a natural stepwise infection will start there, and then it will move to layer 2, the early induced innate response, and then it can move into level 3, which gives you that adaptive response, which takes greater than 96 hours, and that's where the vaccines will start to come in. So you can see that a child needs to have the first 2 layers working really well, because they control and slow down viral multiplication and speed of access into the body. Those first 2 layers and the cell-mediated immune response in the 3rd layer are the key to both efficient control and clearance of pathogens. Now, when you have a natural disease, you'll get that stepwise infection, and all 3 layers will be going at the same time. And then at the end, you end up with your memory immunity, some antibody that feeds back and tells everything to slow down and quiet down. Now, if you're vaccinated with a killed vaccine that has aluminum in it, or an influenza shot, you're going to get that Th2 antibody, also called humoral, and that's what the acellular whooping cough vaccines stimulate. Now, if you have a natural infection or a live viral vaccine, then you're going to have that Th1, Th17 cell-mediated immunity, which is very important, and that's the one that helps you survive the actual infection. It's extremely important. So natural infections, and to some degree the whole cell vaccines that were used in the old days, got to that part. So just remember that for a minute, because that's going to be important in the slides that are coming up. So you should now be able to tell that there's a difference between vaccine immunity and disease immunity for inhaled pathogens. And this is how it pans out, next slide, in terms of bacterial carriage after exposure. I want to point your attention to the next slide, please, to the green line at the bottom. This is that baboon study that I just told you about. So that green line at the bottom, and so what you have on the height of that graph tells you how many bacteria they were able to take out of the lungs of the different groups of those baboons, and then the days after they were re-challenged. So that green line at the bottom, that represents the baboon that was allowed to have a natural whooping cough disease, and then was later re-exposed to the bacteria through the nose, basically, in a pretty large inoculum. They couldn't culture anything out of the lungs of those baboons. Okay? These represent the children that get whooping cough naturally. So you can see that these are the ones that are protecting the herd better than anybody else. And then look at the red line, that's your whole cell vaccine. And you can see that those baboons upon re-exposure carried the bacteria for up to 42 days at very high levels. In some instances, higher than the actively coughing natural disease, which is in blue. So people who undergo infection get solid immunity, and if they contact whooping cough, they immediately throw the bacteria out. They don't carry it and can't spread it. Those are the green line baboons there. Their immunity is also known to last longer, around 20 to 30 years. Why does it last longer? Because it's much more complete, and it's an immunity which is activated through all 3 of those layers of the immune system that I just showed you. Because the vaccinated had their immunity begin on the blood side, on that 3rd layer, after that injection, they hang on to the bacteria longer in their lungs, as seen on that red line, and they're a reservoir for another problem that has been building for the last 10 to 15 years. Next, please. Because it takes vaccinated people longer to toss out the bacteria gets to breed longer and learn new tricks. It's just like antibiotic resistance. The vaccinated are walking laboratories which grow mutant strains of Bordetella pertussis. Next, please. And those strains, it turns out, are also resistant to the vaccine immunity in a person's body because those strains are missing a virulence factor called protactin. And this is just the popular article that was written up about a New England Journal of Medicine article. And these are some of the quotes from it. Next, please. So this is the outcome of what I talked earlier about original antigenic sin or linked epitope suppression. The bacteria wins the game. And the sad thing is that this immunologic phenomenon was first observed quite some time ago. I was able to locate references to it in 1960, where Dr. Thomas Francis, I think, first coined the term original antigenic sin. So they've known about this. Next, please. When an Italian group first examined the issue of mutant strains in 1999, they realized which populations had the most mutant strains. And it was the vaccinated, as you can read in Master Antonio, 1999. The PMID numbers are on my slides, so you can go and retrieve those articles, or at least the abstracts. Then at the bottom, I'm showing you the PMID for another article written in 2014 after an epidemic in Washington State, where the same thing was noted. And what this amounts to is that the vaccinated are breeding mutant strains of bacteria because they are the asymptomatic group that doesn't remove the bacteria immediately. And so the bacteria has time to work out strategies around vaccine-induced immunity. And this is a serious problem which doctors are not talking about, but which needs discussion. Next, please. Because today the phenomenon is pretty much worldwide. It's been documented in Finland, Australia, Japan, France, and the USA. Next, please. And add another layer of negativity to this story. The mutant strains have special capacity to invade the immune system. So you would think that if you don't have a virulence factor, that would be a good thing, but it's not. Protactin mutation is not the only problem. Next, please. Another problem is that vaccination selects for increased virulence from higher toxin production. Now remember, this is a bacteria that secretes several toxins which cause the gagging and vomiting, as well as the force field which fools the immune system. And make no bones about it, pertussis bacteria is an evil bacteria. If you ever wanted to design an evil bacteria, this would be a perfect one. So by no means am I making little of what this bacteria can do. But this is a direct result of faulty immune priming by the vaccines offered to babies and everyone else as boosters. Next, please. So, whooping cough vaccines were introduced on the assumption that vaccines would improve upon natural herd immunity. What they didn't realize is that vaccines would actually change personal immunity and disintegrate herd immunity and change the biology of the bacteria, making the infection endemic again, like we are in today. But this time, with more virulent mutant strains, with vaccinated people as the primary carriers. The other problem is that doctors have trouble diagnosing pertussis because of the herd immunity mindset curriculum in their training, which was wrong. To compound the issue, doctors think that there's only one way to treat whooping cough, and that is with macrolide antibiotics. Next, What most doctors don't realize is the potential downflow of the gold standards that are used. When doctors use antibiotics, the whooping cough often gets worse. But they just think, oh, that's just because whooping cough is nasty, and it would have gotten worse anyway. But in most children treated with antibiotics, the antibiotics do nothing good to help the cough. And, next please, more commonly make the children cough longer and get sicker. And this is exactly what the majority of parents say about their antibiotic-treated kids after they call me. Antibiotics have no reliable place in the treatment regimen. But the other justification for using antibiotics is for limiting the period of contagion. But that also fails more often than is talked about. I've seen it fail more than once. But parents are given the belief that 5 days of antibiotics makes their coughing children no longer contagious. And when that turns out to be wrong, those kids go back into the community and spread more whooping cough. And this is why I'm still a strong proponent of the methods that worked for smallpox in the 1800s and 1900s and other infectious diseases, and that is quarantine and good nutrition. Any parent that calls me with a coughing child, I advise them one way or another that kid needs to stay home, be isolated away from anyone who is pregnant or has a young baby at home. Now, if you've got an asymptomatic carrier, or if you've got a coughing child that's been misdiagnosed, what does that do for your herd immunity? Next slide, please. Remember earlier when I said that doctors don't and won't diagnose whooping cough when it lands in their offices? Well, this is well documented in the literature. Next slide, please. Next. No, sorry, back. There, thank you. It's well documented in the literature, as you can see here, and it's beyond frustrating to intelligent and well-read parents, both vaccinating and non-vaccinating parents, who know what their children have, even though their doctors don't. And the disease is not just misdiagnosed because the vaccine makes the cough milder. That's just an excuse. The elephant in the room is that these kids who are so often and admittedly misdiagnosed are walking around infecting susceptible people. In effect, they are adding to herd immunity, but not in a way that you would necessarily like. Next slide, please. So, the reflexive action of doctors is usually to refuse to test these children when the parents request it. And whether they test or not, they often reach for the prescription pad and pick something on this list. I could argue that the blind and obstinate pediatricians are the worst thing for herd protection ever. They all too often can't diagnose whooping cough, they don't know how to treat it, and they do things that make it worse. And I know this because those parents find me after a long road of frustration and searching and wrong medical diagnoses and treatments. Now, when I first saw whooping cough, I was amazed at how bad the coughing was. And I knew at that point why people wanted to invent a vaccine for it. It's really bad. Now, if there was a safe and highly effective vaccine, maybe I would be in favor of it, but I have yet to meet such a vaccine for any disease. So I went back to square one, and I studied the biochemical reality of the whooping cough bacteria and how they affect the body. And then I decided to study another way, next please, which not only neutralizes toxins, but also strengthens blood vessel walls and makes neutrophils, the very important cells required for this, fighting this battle, perform better. And the result of this is that parents are able to deal with the cough at home while keeping the microbiome stable and functioning because their kids haven't been napalmed with antibiotics, which release even more toxins from the bacteria that die in the colon. And the vitamin C treatment supports the immune system overall. Now, the results aren't a miracle, and I'm very clear about that, but they are a dramatic improvement over gold standard medical practice. So the article that I wrote that has been available online for years and that many parents are using on their own and telling me how things went afterwards, and some parents are taking that article to their healthcare practitioners and they're doing it together. It's called the Vitamin C Treatment of Whooping Cough. It's available on my website, drsuzanne.net. So the situation that we're in now is a direct result of false assumptions about herd immunity by vaccine experts and an abysmal understanding on the part of medical doctors of how to treat a toxin-mediated infection. Now, the only way to fix a problem is to openly admit that the problem exists. Next, please. But the system can't tell that to the public because the illusion must be maintained that they would have it all under control if only people stopped refusing this vaccine. But the fact should now be obvious to you that they have lost control of this disease, no matter how many vaccines are given. So it's therefore up to parents to educate themselves, and if necessary or possible, to educate their doctors. And with that, I am ending a little bit early, and if you have questions now, we can address them.
I got a mic. Anybody have a question?
This young lady right here. you, doctor. It's great talk. I just had a question in regards to the DNA process. When the germ gets into the DNA, does that mean parents pass it down through generations, all these retroviruses?
Well,
That might be more time.
I'm not talking about a retrovirus here, this is a bacteria. And so the bacteria would not get into the parent's DNA. But that's a question for Dr. Judy, perhaps for later.
Okay. I have a couple of quick questions. One is, for the average person, what is the RX for our behavior of how we should respond when we're confronted with a authoritarian imposition suggesting that we have to take a certain vaccine?
Dr. Suzanne on that?
Well, you know, there's an old biblical scripture that says, "My people die from lack of knowledge." And I think it remains true today, no matter what your religion is, that if you don't have knowledge, you're not going to be able to talk to a doctor. But the good news, or any other person that wants to argue, but the good news is that doctors know almost nothing. So you have to learn very little in order to be able to go into a doctor's office and knock them back on their heels. Doctors are overwhelmed. They're told they have to do, you know, a social history, a pap smear, you know, schedule all kinds of tests, write prescriptions, listen to the psychological problems of a person, counsel them on vaccinations, and vaccinate in 15 minutes. You know, they're really overwhelmed, and they don't want to have to do all these things they're being told to do. And they're not taking the time to learn about vaccines like you might have. So just don't be afraid to say what you know, and don't say anything that you don't know. Don't make things up as you go. Leave that to the doctors. They do that quite well.
You know, I have a question. One thing that I was so interested in how passionate the doctors are to get their percentage and numbers up of vaccinated children in their office and their practice, and I won't take your child if they don't. And then I find out that the pharmaceutical industry has financial incentives for them to do this. And so they're looking at my child, grandchild's health in the terms of whether they get a new boat or not. So I'm just wondering, can you address that, what the incentives are for these doctors?
Yeah, but you know, I look at it in a sense that really the pharmaceutical industry owns the world. It doesn't really just own the medical system, the medical doctors. They're pretty much running the country. I think they're now involved in the medical industrial complex. I mean, one of the articles that I deconstructed last year was written by a grant from the Bill Gates Foundation as well as the Department of Homeland Security, and it was in Science magazine, Dr. Judy's favorite journal, and it was supposed to be a game changer, getting doctors and parents to believe that if your child doesn't die of measles itself, they'll die of the immune suppression that happens later, which is total immunologic BS. So, you know, when it comes to the ownership of the medical information, the pharmaceutical industry has been in the medical curriculum for a really long time. So you have the problem of doctors being brainwashed, just like I was. I know very full well how that works. And we have no reason to doubt the institution that we paid up to $500,000 for that secret information, and that's paying us all this money. I mean, it has to be the best that's available, right? And then you have the incentives on top, but I honestly don't believe that that's the biggest story. I mean, yeah, doctors like to have money, we all like to have money to a certain degree, but it's more like you're punished. I mean, I think that's really how it's looked at. Like in the hospital that was vaccinating my sick patients, the patients with cancer, while they're actively getting chemotherapy, you know, they were also vaccinating because if they didn't have a high enough degree of vaccination, then the reimbursements from the governmental institutions was cut. So it's a matter of incentive and it's a matter of punishment. So it's like this Pavlovian dog experiment. So first you get the brainwashing that this really is the right thing to do, that you and I are crazy people that are interrupting a really good thing that's been going on for a long time, the greatest revolution in health, you know, ever, is what they say, which is why we had to write Dissolving Illusions. And then you've got the financial stimulus on top of that. So they kind of attack everything like the Native Americans would attack one bull. You know, they surround it and put several arrows in it at once. So I can't really point to any one arrow that's leading to this blind, devastating practice of vaccinating all these children no matter what. I think it's a multifactorial disease that the system has.
You know, one thing I wanted to bring up is, I'm a talk show host and a news site. We, really, we put this all together in a couple of weeks. I mean, you know, it just needed to be done. The first Saturday we had available to rock and roll. And the thing that I got the most, it was standard trolling, somebody online sending articles that are years old of somebody, and I start scratching the surface and looking who this person is that wrote this, and it goes back to pharma. And I'm wondering what kind of pressure you get personally on your website or the Twitter feeds, or somebody writes something, Dr. Suzanne doesn't know anything. Where does that come from? What's her bona fides?
Where does it come from?
Yeah, I mean, you have somebody, I am the authority and I have a white lab coat and a stethoscope around my neck,
okay.
and I say Dr. Suzanne doesn't know what she's talking about. Who are these people?
Well, you know, you know what, I don't know. I've never seen their bank accounts. I don't know where the money, some of them I actually believe the BS that they are throwing at us, and I think that there are others that are paid, that are on the payroll. There's evidence that they actually advertise for these social media jobs, that the pharmaceutical industries do that. But they're certainly out there, and they're anonymous, and that's really what bothers me more than anything. It's like the only valid critique of dissolving illusions came from a supposed crunchy mother named Isabella B. And my guess is that was a group of men who were sitting down and trying to deconstruct my measles chapter. And so I had to respond to that. And it took about 3 months for me to put together that 70-page response. So these people are, you know, their primary job is to discredit, to have people doubting, to be ashamed of themselves, you know, that to make us think that we are, you know, destroying the health of vulnerable babies. And of course that pulls on anybody's heartstrings if you don't know what you're talking about. So, you know, definitely it comes from a source that has vast, nearly unlimited amounts of money. I can tell you that much.
Go ahead and introduce yourself and ask your question, please.
Hi, I'm Roger. I was just wondering what you thought about the idea of introducing vaccinations to somebody who has chronic disease. I was advised to take pneumococcal and flu vaccinations after having severe renal acute failure. I refuse on the basis that by definition creates more inflammation. If you already have a degenerative process, you want to add to that, besides the contamination of blood issue. But other thing on the vitamin C there, are you talking about intravenous, oral, or lipospheric? What forms?
Okay, well, if you go read the article, you'll see exactly the forms that I'm talking about, even what brands that I recommend, because they're the ones that I use the most, but it's oral. You know, IV vitamin C is out of your body in 6 hours. You get a nice high spike in your system, but then it's gone. So even if you're taking IV vitamin C, you should still be taking oral vitamin C in frequent doses throughout the day. As far as vaccinating sick people, you know, that's really what got me activated and really alarmed at what was going on around me. And I don't ever tell somebody not to vaccinate, and I never tell somebody to vaccinate. My advice to you is to go and read everything the CDC has to say about these vaccines, and know that there is an element of truth in what the CDC says, but they're leaving out the bigger, more important part of the picture. And so you also need to balance that information by reading outside the CDC. And if someone's going to belittle you and make fun of you for using Google, remind them that it is the largest library that's ever existed on the planet at one time, okay? And you have the discernment to read through things. You're an intelligent person who can read and decide what's valid and what's not. And there's plenty of evidence that the World Health Organization has had corrupt dealings and many conflicts of interest. So you have to be able to read widely and decide what's right for you. I can't tell you what's right for you, because the truth is that those vaccines can prevent some of those infections. But the question is it worth taking that risk? And you already know that there's something that's very risky about doing that.
We also have another question back here.
Hi, my name is BJ. My wife's got me into this, and more interested in talks really highly about you. So you spoke really well, late before you spoke really well about all the knowledge, all the information we need to learn. While the vast majority of doctors and parents kind of follow the rhetoric that everyone's told them because they have the same fears as everyone does. As you said, whooping cough is a very, it's a very nasty disease to get, and a lot of these other diseases are very nasty. So from your
would I say the solution is for?
So, for all the parents out there who look to vaccines to help their children, and the doctors that believe that vaccines are the answer, what would you believe would be the appropriate solution for a lot of these diseases that a lot of these parents are afraid of their children getting?
Well, the first thing I do is I ask parents which disease they're afraid of. And what I find really interesting is that, let me ask you, which diseases are you afraid of?
Well, I mean, becoming a parent, you start learning a few things. I mean, when I first became a parent, you talk about whooping cough, and that freaked us out. You know, you hear about autism, and that freaks you out, you know, and then you just kind of hear more and more about it.
But what diseases, if you were going to pick any disease you want to vaccinate for, which ones do you want to vaccinate for?
Government.
Well, I mean, you start just learning about this. I mean, you learn about diseases that, you know, kill out populations like forever ago, right? But
No, which ones in your head are haunting you?
right, particularly now.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not really thinking of any right now, but as I was becoming a parent, you know, I mean, you learn more as you go on that you didn't really think about before until you had a child. And so, like I said, whooping cough was one of them. You know, the first one they talked about whooping cough and autism for the first two, but then now there was talk about measles and, you know, all these other things.
Okay.
And those are common things that those are in the minds of parents, not just myself, but the mass populace.
Well, what I find is that parents usually have two diseases that, for whatever reason, they're afraid of. Because I think they kind of argue with themselves, if I only give 2 vaccines, then I'm going to be doing my best. And it's always 2 different diseases. But polio is usually in there, and then there's usually meningitis. And it's usually based on images that they've seen in the media flashed in front of them and on very narrow and limited information. So really, the only solution for that is knowledge. And what you'll find if you talk to parents in this audience, you talk to Marcy, who will tell you her story, the more knowledge a person has, the less fear they have. It's as simple as that. So if you're fearful of something, I guarantee you it is not because you have read widely from both sides. It's because you haven't read enough.
4 minutes.
Hi. I have a kid who had autism who's recovered. He's 18 and we don't vaccinate, obviously. And he's going to college this next year. And every college that we've looked at has requirements now, and his vaccine waiver doesn't count. Once you're 18, which I didn't know. And so I'm wondering if you think there's any safe way to do a couple of the vaccines that are required for him to attend college. I wonder what your opinion is.
Yeah, you're never going to get me to say that. Okay, you know, if someone has to get vaccinated because they're in the military, you know, maybe, but no, I can't tell you there's a safe way to get vaccinated. Nobody can tell you there's a safe way. So what I say is find a college, you know, go to their exemption, because a lot of times they'll tell you there aren't exemptions, but you go to the website and there actually are. And as far as when people tell me they want to go into the healthcare field, I go become a chiropractor. Go into chiropractic school. It's the only healing profession that's worthy of going into, as far as I'm concerned, to say. Although, you know, if you want to go into medicine, there's always surgery, which is valid, but you have to get vaccinated. So you can't go into medical school and you can't be a conventional medical doctor in an institution without getting vaccinated. You can still be a chiropractor without being vaccinated, although they are getting into the chiropractic schools as well, so you have to be carefully choosing those schools too.
I just wanted to respond. So our organization does a lot of work with college immunization because we're out of California, and the University of California just recently put their new immunization policy together, which only allows medical exemptions. But most other schools have a religious exemption at least. You just have to go digging for it or ask for it. So I would, unless, as Suzanne said, you're in the medical field, then they require the vaccination. But if you're not going into the medical field, most of them have a religious or hospital exemption.
One last question.
One more question.
With whooping cough, I've never heard it. Once you've had whooping cough, are you build an immunity and you won't repeat it again?
Well, the answer to your first part, the first part is you build an immunity, and you saw the green line, the baboons that were naturally infected didn't harbor any bacteria after sniffing a large amount of it. As far as getting sick again, it doesn't last forever. None of see, all the diseases are different in how long they program the immune system, and so are the vaccines. So with whooping cough, you're looking at about 20 years of immunity from the natural infection, and the whole cell vaccines, in some cases, were able to mirror that, but the acellular vaccines are not. So it's not lifelong, but what I find is a lot of parents end up getting infected, but it's usually not a terrible cough like you'll see the first time in a person's life. And you know, the bacteria is everywhere. It's probably in this room right now. It's not like you can escape it. So we're all being exposed to it on an ongoing basis, and I think that's why a lot of parents don't get sick when their kids do. But I've seen all kinds of combinations of family members getting sick.
Real quick.
Sorry, real quick. So my husband is a medical doctor, and he is, our son is not vaccinated. He is forced to have a flu shot every year for his employment. Are you aware of there being any kind of exemption for employees?
Well, I signed an exemption every year for my own flu shots. So we were able to have a philosophical exemption. Now, I think they'll probably get rid of that at some point, but so far it was still there. So what he should look into is what the institution's actual policy, make them put it on paper for him, what their policy is, what exemptions they have. And then he needs to get a group of people together that don't want to get shot every year and show them the efficacy values of this vaccine and how the data just doesn't pan out when it comes to that he's being a good citizen and a good doctor protecting his patients. It's not there.
Okay, I get to ask the last question because I can. Trains run on time. When my grandchildren were born, you're in the waiting room, and all of a sudden, here comes a nurse or a doctor, and they have all this whole family, and they had a target-rich environment. They go, who here is going to touch this baby? Who here has a whooping cough vaccination? You don't want to kill your grandchild, do you? So this kind of pressure that goes in on the, when they want you to, you're going to sign to have your child vaccinated or not. It's like, during a contraction, they put it to your daughter-in-law, your daughter's on their lap. And I'm just like, is there a reason for this? Why would we want to get the vaccination and introduce this pathogen into our bodies before we have access to a child? Is that effective? Is that a scam? Tell me about that.
Well, I did address that in the talk, and that, they call that cocooning, where they vaccinate the people around the baby in the hopes that they will then form a wall around that baby of immunity. But the problem is, if you bring that Warfel article that's available online, Warfel 2014, and you hand it to that nurse, and you say, you sit down and you read this article, and then you will talk about it afterwards, who in this family is going to be vaccinated. You have to have the knowledge is there. That's what's so amazing about whooping cough, is they don't have a leg to stand on. But if you have two legs to stand on, you've got an argument. If you don't know the information, you're going to lose every time, because they are in the white coats, they are the authorities, they are the hospital, but they don't have the information and they don't have the knowledge. What they have is fear and false belief in what they're doing.
Dr. Suzanne Humphrey, thank you very much.